Professor Emeritus at University of Oslo, and he'll give us a talk on one of the topics of research he has been pursuing since a very long time. There's a publication, a book on Husserl, 58, and it's also his most recent project. The next book he's working on will also be on Husserl. So thank you very much for giving us this talk on Husserl and Indexicals.
Yeah. Yes, I'm sorry I have to speak English rather than French. And also that the quotations that I prepared, I have them in German. But I'll try to extemporate it into English. It will be too hard for me to go straight from German to French. And as was said, Husserl has been a main interest for me for a long, long time, for about 50 years. And there are still lots of things to do on Husserl. And what I wanted to concentrate on now is something that I promised to write on for a German book that is coming out next year. And it's good for me to have this discussed in this group, because when I propose this topic, it is because I know that here you are really very interested in indexicals. I know that you also do a lot of philosophy of language in general. And I hope that these things from Husserl might also interest you. Often one thinks that there is a kind of opposition between Husserl on the one hand and so-called analytic philosophy on the other. And I think that the way I use the word analytic, Husserl is an analytic philosophy. So there's no reason to think that there is any opposition. However, a good deal of Husserl scholarship has been done by people who have a kind of antipathy to analytic philosophy. And I think that is, if you don't know the discussion going on in analytic philosophy, you'll miss many points in Husserl. And one of the points you might miss would be these rather interesting discussions of indexicals. And you know, I think that Husserl, who had this discussion at the very beginning of the 20th century, just from 1900 on, really had a much more advanced understanding of indexicals than anybody else at that time. You have people like Bolzano has something on indexical, and you have Frege. And Frege saw that his view on Sinn und Bedeutung, sense and reference, was in for some trouble in connection with indexicals. And he has some remarks on indexicals, and it's a little odd that he didn't explore that further, because he has only some hints. Maybe he saw that these were so serious problems that he would need more time for them, but even in his manuscripts, you don't really get very much on indexicals. The best attempt is something that Wolfgang Kühne in Hamburg has done. He has tried to systematize these hints by Frege and developed a kind of approach called hybrid expressions. And I'll say a little bit about that too, because that also comes in connection with Husserl. But I think I would start by mentioning the work that has been done by various people on this problem. I think when we write on something, we should always be careful to give credit to people who have been working on it. And the main discussions are found in work by David Smith and Ronald McIntyre. David Smith teaches at Irvine, and Ronald McIntyre teaches outside of Los Angeles. And they have written things together, a book called Husserl on intentionality. They have also written a good deal of articles, particularly Ronald McIntyre has written one on intending and referring, which is on indexicals. And these were things from the early 80s. And also, independently of them, Phillips has written an article from 1982, the same year as McIntyre's and Smith's book, called The Problem of Occasional Expressions in Edmund Husserl's Logical Investigations. So that I think Phillips's work is the first one written by people who were basically phenomenologists and who had not worked so much on the philosophy of language, while David Smith and Ronald McIntyre they have their education from Stanford, and they are very familiar with issues in the philosophy of language, and it would be natural for them to notice these ideas in Husserl. After that, there have been other people working on the problems. Kevin Mulligan and Barry Smith have written an article called A Husserlian Theory of Indexicality, which is in the Grazer Philosophische Studien from 1986, so it's 4 years later than these other people. And then a person named Schumann, who has been working at the Husserl archives, has also written an article called Husserl's Theory of Indexicals from 1993. And then I think there are other things that are relevant to it, like Wolfgang Künne's articles on Frege, because Künne also has some familiarity with Husserl and often relates what he does to Husserl. And there is also a book by one of Künne's students on Bolzano's theory of indexicals, and that's by Marcus Textor, Bolzano's Propositionalismus, which came in 1996, and he also has some remarks on Husserl. And there are very, very close connections between Bolzano and Husserl. In fact, when I teach Husserl, I tend to start with Bolzano. The first time I ever taught a course on Husserl, which was in 1961, I gave my first 7 lectures on Bolzano because I thought that Bolzano was easier to understand than Husserl. Bolzano is extremely pedagogical, extremely clear, and he puts forth ideas that are very helpful in understanding Husserl. And this is not accidental. Actually, when Husserl gave up his early psychologism and turned to what he called phenomenology, that was very much inspired by Bolzano. In the mid-90s, 1890s, he read Bolzano's Wissenschaftslehre very carefully. And there are many, many traces of Bolzano in Husserl, so it was natural for Textor, when he writes on Bolzano and also discusses Bolzano's theory of indexicals, to refer to Husserl. But these are the main contributions so far to this field. And now I thought we should concentrate on Husserl and look at texts and so on by Husserl. And the problem now is that since I've been writing this in German, I have been including passages from Husserl in German. And I even handed out a page to you, which is in German. And also you don't read German to send a page on to others. I think I had about 15 of those pages. And I will translate them, the pertinent parts of it, because that particular double page that I handed out is interesting because Husserl there introduces an example which most of you will connect with Hilary Putnam, namely the twin world problems. He was aware, at the beginning of the 20th century, that there are thought experiments like the twin world that create a good deal of problems for theories of indexicals. And Husserl himself started out presenting his theory of indexicals in 1900 in the Logical Investigations, which was his first phenomenological work. But he saw that there were problems in that theory. And in his manuscripts, you can see that he is continuing to work on it. And what makes Husserl a good philosopher is that he is very problem conscious. He has enough imagination to think of examples that don't fit in with this theory, and he gets disturbed by them and sees that this theory has to be brought back to the drawing board. And he had 3 stages then in this development. The first is the published version of the Logical Investigations, 1900. Then there are a good deal of discussions in manuscripts that led to the second edition of the Logical Investigations. Most of those date from around 1908. But even in the second edition, although he improved his view, he saw that it didn't work quite properly, and the twin world example is one of the problems that he saw. And he then started on a 3rd stage in order to deal with those. And that 3rd stage is not really completed. you could say that he was such a good philosopher that he saw that whatever ideas he got, they were problems. And what we'll do is to end up with the problems. But we'll see the stages that he went through on his way. Now, basically, Husserl is similar to Bolzano and Frege in that he emphasizes a good deal distinctions between what Frege called sense and reference. And his view on sense is a little richer than that of Frege. When you read Frege, you get the idea that the sense is just what is needed in order to fix the reference, and that's all. But for Husserl, the senses are very, very rich. They have a lot to them, even things that we are not conscious of, things that deal with the present situation we are in and so on, so that what we are expressing depends not only on the words that we are uttering, but on that whole situation in which we are now. For those of you who know John Perry's work, and I think he has spent enough time here in this institution so that many of you are familiar with him, very many of John Perry's ideas about how there is a kind of excess information when we utter things that comes from the whole situation and so on, is similar to things that you also have in Husserl. Of course, independent, but still similar. Now, Bolzano and Frege were aware that this sense-reference approach isn't really quite good for indexicals, like the word I, and so on. And both of them try to deal with it to some extent, but I think Husserl took these problems much more seriously and really worked it out much more in detail than any of the other two. And I'll now quote some passages from Husserl. These are not on the handout, and I do have them in German, but I'll at least be able to translate it into English, if not in French. The word I refers from case to case to another person, and it does it by help of every new Bedeutung, that is senses, meanings. And what the meaning of the word I is can only be grasped from the occasion where it is used and the anschauliche surroundings, that is the perceptual situation in which that expression is being used. From that whole context, you can get what the word is, what the word I refers to. And then there's another interesting passage also from the logical investigations. I start with passages from the logical investigation, and then we get on to these later stages later. And this is a passage that might remind some of you of Perry's observations in the essential indexical. Husserl says, we know that the word I is a word by which the speaker refers to himself. But this idea we get, this meaning we get of the word, or these associated meaning, these associations we have with the word when we hear it, and we know that it refers to the speaker, they are not the meaning of the word I. If that were the case, we could express this meaning by some other expression. For example, the one who is now speaking and who is referring to himself. But this substitution, such a substitution, would not only lead to uncommon ways of speaking, but to ways of speaking that are not having the same sense as what you had originally. So the word I cannot be replaced by a more complex expression which expresses the same meaning as the word I. Of course, you have a little hint of that in Frege when he says that the word I expresses something that can properly be grasped only by the speaker. But that's a little mysterious. And of course, Perry gives examples of how you could try to replace I with some other expression, and how there always will be new problems coming up. And this is something that Husserl points out in 1900. And he also says that the word I is not in the normal way many or ambiguous, although it, for Frege the problem was that the reference is a function of the sense, and if the reference is different, then the sense must be different each time the word I is expressed. And Husserl says that the word I is not, doesn't have many different senses in that way, because we should rather think of there being two senses associated with the word which build upon one another. The first is a kind of general function that the word I would have, and which is connected with the word, and which makes it possible for us to understand what the person refers to who uses the word I. And then there is another Vorstellung. It's not quite good to translate it by sense here. Idea, the representation, which becomes associated with the word. The word I has this basic linguistic sense that when you hear it, you will look for something else that is needed to supplement it. And that supplement would be a kind of second level. There is a double kind of sense. It's a little bit like ideas you find in Kaplan when he starts discussing indexicals, that you have to distinguish these two factors, and you have to find the differences between different theories of indexicals is often how those two factors are separated, how you conceive of each of those two factors. And the first of these two meanings we could call the anzeigende, the referring meaning. We don't mean anything like reference, but the one that points on to something. And the second is, he called the angezeigte, that is that which is pointed to. So this idea of splitting this into two and developing that idea of a split meaning, two-stage meaning, is one that nobody before Husserl had ever tried to suggest, and Husserl does in the logical investigation try to explore that further. So this is something where I think he was quite a lot ahead of his time. Maybe some of you know, but I haven't found that idea in anybody before Kaplan, except in Husserl, these two stages. So these are passages from Husserl's work, the logical investigation, first stage of his work, which I think anticipate things in later treatment of indexicals. But I'll now quote some other passages as well, just to give you a flavor of the kind of things Husserl was aware of and what he says about it. He says that there's a combination of perception and meaning in our use of indexicals. It's not all indexicals. He has, what about the now and things like that. But this is an example where he discusses the this, he says, and all these passages are from the logical investigation. So until we get to the manuscripts, I will not give any further references. You can have the page references if you want to later. But I say this, and now mean the paper lying before me. Perception is responsible for the relation of my word to this object, but my meaning does not lie in perception. An act of this meaning builds itself on my perception, depends on it. So this is one of the issues that Husserl is very interested in parts of the logical investigations, this kind of intertwinedness of perception and linguistic meaning. And his later philosophy in the Ideas, where he discusses the notion of a noema, is particularly useful for that kind of intertwining, because in the logical investigations he's still struggling with finding a good way of connecting perception with meaning. And I look upon one major motivation for Husserl's leaving or finding unsatisfactory certain aspects of his view in the logical investigations and going on to write and publish the ideas in 1913, 13 years later, very much have to do with how to conceive in the proper way the relation between linguistic meaning and the kind of meaning structure that he thinks is involved in perception. And it is this interplay between linguistic meaning and perceptual meaning that is at the core of his attempt to deal with indexicals. So he says that it's a this meaning, I'll quote that last sentence, an act of this meaning builds itself on my perception, it depends on it. And I should note maybe that Barry Smith and Kevin Mulligan, in this article on a Husserlian theory of indexicality, they are very happy with Husserl's presentation of discussion of indexicals in the logical investigations. And they say that they can't really see what the point would be of trying to improve upon that theory, as Husserl did in his later works. And especially they react against the ideas because they think that notion of noema is a deterioration in Husserl. And I think that's unfortunate, because I think that the notion of noema in the later work is really an improvement, an attempt to deal with problems. And also it's, if you interpret a philosopher and the philosopher himself is unsatisfied with his view and finds examples which he finds cannot properly be handled by the early view, then you should really look closely at the later view and try to see how it was motivated and how it tries to deal with those problems. So although I think that both Mulligan and Barry Smith do very good work on Husserl, they are a little blinded by saying that the only part of Husserl worth reading is the logical investigations. And I have much higher respect for the later works by Husserl, and including the ideas. And I think that one has to really see what is going on. And one thing that is going on here is this interplay between perception and use of language. But the passage now was from the investigations. He just points out that we have to find a way of dealing with that interplay. That's necessary in order to deal properly with indexicals. I'll also quote another passage from the logical investigations where Husserl points to certain similarities between indexicals and proper names. And notice now how his view on proper names is really quite different from that of Frege. He says, indexicals are much like proper names if the latter function with their authentic meaning. For a proper name also names an object directly. It means it not in the attributive way as the bearer of these or those properties, but without such conceptual mediation as that which it itself is, just as perception may set it before our eyes. So this is a kind of hint of what we now tend to call the new theory of reference, namely that there is a kind of direct reference relation in connection with proper names and the objects they refer to. He doesn't really develop any semantics for proper names, but he's aware that the traditional Frege view on proper names is not satisfactory. So it's not by the mediation of something conceptual that the proper names function. And he thinks that they are similar to the indexicals. They could help for understanding proper names, look at indexicals, and conversely. So that there are some passages that you find in the logical investigations, and the examples he gives of indexicals can be treated approximately here, but there are problems, and he sees that the main problem is really to get a proper theory of the interplay between linguistic meaning and perception. How can perception actually contribute to the communication that takes place by help of language? And the way I look upon Husserl, that is the kind of problem that he saw with his early theory, that he hadn't worked out that properly yet in the logical investigations. and he tries to find ways of dealing with it in his later writings. And I want now to say a few words about hybrid proper names, because the first passage I quoted from Husserl here, where Husserl writes that the meaning of the word I can only be grasped from that whole situation in which the word I is used. That hints a little bit at a view which Frege expressed 14 years later in a theory of what we call hybrid proper names. Or Frege doesn't call it that, but I think Kynne really found a good word for it, where what is expressed by a linguistic expression is not just some kind of lexical meaning that that word would have by itself, but you have to take into account the whole context within which that word is being used. And it's the linguistic expression together with that whole context that you actually perceive. You notice what the person is doing, you notice you have some idea what the person is perceiving, you notice lots of features about the situation, so that the setting satisfies the condition that Saussure, for example, put, that the medium through which you communicate has to be accessible to the senses. And it's that whole setting, material setting, including the expression, that in this passage by Husserl might seem to be what expresses the meaning. And that is pretty much as far as Frege ever got in dealing with indexicals. And he even has only hints at it, so that what Kynne has done in his work, do you know this work by Kynne? I should mention it because I think Wolfgang Kynne is one of the really good philosophers in Germany nowadays. He's in Hamburg, and he wrote this article called Hybrid Proper Names in Mind, 1992. And he also has written an article in Grazer Philosophische Studien earlier in 1983, where he talks about Indexicalität, Sinn, und propositionaler Gehalt, indexicals meaning and propositional content. And both of these and some other things also by Kynne are very, very good exposition of that idea of Frege. And Kynne has a very positive attitude to that idea. I think that's always good when you want to give a good interpretation, try to make the interpretation as good as possible, so that various objections should not too easily be raised against it. And there's a lot of textual evidence. I think Kynne has done a very good job in giving something which I think is a very plausible rendering of what Frege's approach to indexicals would have been if he had sat down and worked it out further. And a little interesting thing here that I might mention is that the Swedish Academy of Science gives out what's called a shock prize in logic and philosophy every 2 years. And 2 years ago, Saul Kripke got that prize. And the prize winner has to give a lecture relating to what he's working on. And Kripke decided to give a lecture on indexicals. And that lecture was almost exactly Kynne. Because again, Kripke wanted to work out what he thought might be a plausible way of working out these hints in Frege. So that's what he said, that this is maybe what Frege could have gotten to if he had worked further on it. And after his lecture, I told Kripke that, I asked Kripke whether he ever read Kynne, and he had never read Kynne. And I told him that what you have said is almost identical with what Kripke. And I think that's right, that he probably never had read Kynne, but it is a very natural idea to work out. And of course, Kripke was really was disappointed. He probably had hoped to publish this thing, but now it's all anticipated by Kynne. But in any case, Kynne himself seems to me to think that this is a satisfactory treatment of indexicals. But Husserl saw that it is not. And that's why Husserl really has to go into this problem of perception and that interplay between perception and linguistic meaning in order to be able to deal with it. And, well, at least now you have seen what worried Husserl in the beginning, the first logical investigation view, namely that interplay. And in the manuscripts, I mentioned that there's a kind of second version of Husserl's view. That is the manuscripts that partly were included in the second revised version of the logical investigations, and you there do find a little more on that interplay between meaning and perception. But you can see from Husserl's manuscript that he's not really satisfied. And now you see in the manuscripts that he got, that's 1912, that he got this example of the twin word, and he saw that raises problems. And now this is not what you have on that handout, but since many of you don't read German, I will translate this. He starts by saying, and I guess that's at the top of the first page, isn't it? Yeah. Yes, at the top of the first page.
In what year Husserl wrote this?
This was from 1912. And that is the last. I've been through pretty much all the manuscripts by Husserl, 40,000 pages. Not just looking for this, but of course, since I work on Husserl in general, I have been finding lots of other things, but I have not found any later treatment by Husserl on Indexicals. So this is his last word, and he certainly didn't consider it the final word because he's aware that this is still full of problems. But he says that however, if on two heavenly bodies, two people are in the exact same surrounding, and they are facing the same objects, and they are wanting to say something about objects, and they use the word this. Does that this then have a different meaning in these two cases? So it's like Putnam's example with the twin words, where everything is the same, that even the speaker, the mental states of the speaker and so on will be the same. So in that way, what bothers Husserl here in that example is that the mental thing, everything having to do with what you try to express linguistically, that first stage of meaning. You remember you have it split in two stages in the logical investigations. The first stage seems to be the same. The meaning of the word is the same. And the perceptual stage seems to be similar. Because after all, the whole perceptual setting is exactly the same in the case of these two words. That's also what Putnam is worrying about. And so both stages in this treatment of indexicals that we heard about seems to be the same. And what then? We still feel that we are talking about two different objects, because after all, they're two words. And Husserl asks, how can that be dealt with? Because intuitively we would say, knowing about this situation, that the one person, when he uses the word this, refers to an object in that world, and the other person to an object in the other world. And Husserl's, then in the further discussion that you have on those 2 pages I handed out, and there are more, there are about 10 more pages coming, but I thought I would not bother you with too much. But in any case, in the next few lines of that handout, and I don't think I'll try to translate it literally because that makes it more complicated, so I'll try to paraphrase what I'm saying myself. Husserl says that it's from our external point of view that we can say that the word this has 2 different references. Because for us, these situations are really different situations. There are 2 words, we can distinguish the one from the other. But for the person, this, the person in one world and person in the other, from their perspective, there is no difference in either of those two components. Of course, the linguistic meaning, this is the same, and the perceptual content, everything there is the same. And this is then what Husserl now is struggling with in the rest of this manuscript. How can we bring in some difference? What he mostly thinks about, the road he seems to want to go, is to say that it becomes relativized. That the word this, of course it refers to a particular object for one person, it refers to a particular object for another, but as long as you are not aware of the twin worlds, you will have every reason to think that you're talking about the same object. It's only by changing your perspective and getting out of it that you can talk about there being actually two different references for the this, and about these two people being confused. So that coming to an outside perspective, you can talk about the confusion between these two. But Husserl still worries a little bit about this, because he says that one thing is what the person using the this might seem to refer to, but another thing is what somebody from the outside perspective might say. And given the outside perspective, you would say that these two thises refer to distinct objects, although from the point of view of the person using the words itself, from those points of view, they seem to be the same. And you can have it, he also goes to a variant of this example, where you don't have two different people, but you have one person who is in one world, and then is led over into another world and through a lot of labyrinthic ways, and gets back to exactly a similar setting. And there's nothing there that makes the person think that it's a different one. And he will use the word this again. And for the person, the word this seems to refer to exactly the same object. But we who know who has moved from one word to another would say, no, they're two different objects. So it shows for Husserl that there is something more going on than just the perceptual sense, which is the same for both, and the meaning of the expression. And there are hints in Husserl that actually you have to look upon the perceptual process as a part of this physical world in which the person lives. You have to become a kind of externalist. That's how we would put it now, in order to deal with this. You can't deal with it by just looking at the perceptual content and the linguistic meaning, but you have to bring in some way or other the body that is affected physically by the surroundings, and bring in that aspect of the perceptual process. And in the ideas, he does actually develop his view on perception so that there's room for such a thing. This manuscript is written before the ideas, written 1912, the ideas in 1913, but he does not in the ideas discuss Indexicals. So there's no place in Husserl where he really works out whether this would be a satisfactory way of dealing with Indexicals, but I think we can see how he was aware of the problems, how he saw that there has to be something with the interplay between perception and linguistic meaning that is the way to go, but that perceptual meaning by itself isn't enough. There has to be something involving our body and the concrete physical processes that affect our body. That's my talk. I could have made it much longer by including much more citations from the German, but I guess this is enough. Yeah.
In defense of Frege,
Yes.
one might say that Frege has these constraints that sense determines reference,
Yeah.
which apparently Husserl doesn't have.
the constraint that sense.
That sense determines reference.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Which apparently
Husserl
doesn't have.
No. Because Husserl says that sense is important, but there are more factors needed. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not saying that sense reduces to that which determines reference, but simply that there is this constraint, sense determines reference. And apparently Husserl doesn't have that. Because if he had, he couldn't say that we have the same sense for these two indexicals and different reference.
No. But you see, that's the problem for the whole approach to this via sense, as it is in Frege and as it is also in Balzano. Although in Balzano there are some hints that are interestingly in another direction. But in Frege, he really wants this abstract notion of sense to do the whole job. And of course, it never worked out properly, this theory of hybrid proper names. But I think that it's quite clear from the text that if there is any theory that he has thought a little bit about, it's this one. And it's, of course, very consistent with Frege's general approach, that you want a sense which is rich enough to uniquely determine that object. And he thinks you can get it if you have both the whole situation, the whole concrete material situation in which this is used, plus the expression, this. And Husserl, in this twin world example, which came long before Frege's hybrid theory, Husserl saw that you really have to bring in something causal, you could say, something physical going on. You can't get it all put into the notion of sense.
No, my point was that this, you're right about the precedence, I'm not saying this came before Frege, but my point is that if you have this principle that sense determines reference, that's, if you have that, then you are bound to accept something like this, that is purely qualitative sense. You have to bring in the causal element. That's the only way to guarantee that this constraint will be satisfied. Because you can always have thought experiments like solve for the experiment. That's a good thing, and that's a good principle for Frege to have. Because that shows that then the content of perceptual experience cannot be the sense, and at best it can be a sort of the type of sense or something like this. But each individual senses, insofar as they determine reference, will have to differ even if they share this qualitative component. So that's
this whole there's a lot in Husserl on this in the manuscripts, and the whole discussion includes not only things I talk about, but it also has some relevance to the discussion of qualia, for example, and many of Paris' later works really. It seems as if Husserl has had glimpses of things that one would have to take into account. It was aware of problems and so on that point very much in that direction, that there is something more needed than just this notion of sense. But
I wonder about this externalist, internalist controversy. And you mentioned that we should be externalist to cope with the problem, but in which sense it does mean that this internal perspective is sort of confused, and or we must just distinguish between the two properly. How it works.
Well, of course, these labels, internalism and externalism, are used a little bit loosely and differently in different people. And what I had in mind when I used the words now was that Husserl, like Frege, tries very hard to account for the use of indexicals by only appealing to some kind of extended notion of sense, like Frege's, the sense expressed by hybrid expressions. And Husserl, mainly through this twin world example, sees that there seems to be a problem with that. And I quoted at the very beginning. Don't see it.
So you're saying that this is I thought it was a problem for Husserl's view, that you need a second layer, basically perceptual sense added to the, say, linguistic meaning, which is. So I thought that, and then we have this problem that simply having this perceptual sense in the everyday sense of this experience is not enough, because there is this external component. But that's not an objection to the hybrid view. That is the view that the sense which we may understand in one way or another, is expressed not by the expression, the linguistic expression, but by the linguistic expression
plus
and
the
surrounding.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah.
You haven't yet said exactly what the sense is on this hybrid view, and there are different ways to go, one of which may well take account of external factors.
Well, it promised how to bring these external factors in, because what I meant by the internalist versus externalist would be that the internalist would use what we call an abstract sense that contains no causal processes or anything like that. And that Husserl, you could have a causal theory of perception, and Husserl actually proposes something very much like a causal theory of perception. And he says that even when you look at the sense, there will be components in the sense of perception which correspond to your being affected by the object. So that when you perceive, then of course your attention is focused on the object, but the fact that you perceive and not are just imagining things is reflected in the sense in that you are conceiving of the world as one in which the object that you perceive are actually affecting your senses. And therefore, if you were in a situation where you suddenly think you can see something that is on the other side of a big tree, you might wonder what is happening here. And so that, although you don't think about this all the time, I mentioned that Husserl's notion of sense is very rich, and there will be built into it a lot of elements that we never think about. But if they are violated, then we think there's something funny going on. And that causal element in perception is among those. And that he has early. So but he sees that you could have all of that element and still there could be problems with the actual concrete causal process.
Does it mean that identity of meaning is sort of relativized?
Yeah.
I mean, it's distinguishable. We can distinguish between meanings externally, but can't internally.
Yeah.
Or it's still Husserl thinks that just this external view is correct and this internal is just confusion of two different things.
Yeah. In this twin world discussion, he does say that we who are external to the situation can see that the word this is really referring to two different objects. But when I use the word externalism, I'm not simply thinking of an external observer, but that we have to bring into the theory of reference of Indexicals some kind of physical connection and not just the sense corresponding to it in the notion of the sense that is involved in perception. Husserl has a rather elaborate theory of the word, of sense, in the sense of meaning, in connection with perception. But the physical process itself is not part of the sense, but there's a reflection in the sense of that physical process. And what he seems to be worrying about in these manuscripts is whether you can manage, without bringing in that concrete physical event, whether you can manage just with sense. And he seems to see that seems to be, he cannot see any way of doing it.
At least some of the material of my question you've begun to deal with already.
Oh, yeah.
But I wanted to see if I'd got a clear view on the dialectic between you and François Kennedy a moment ago. A Phrygian tries to say that because sense determines reference, when you're faced with these problems where there clearly is difference in reference, there has to be some change to our conception of what sense is in order to be able to make sense of this. You have to reconfigure the idea of sense. So it's no longer equivalent to linguistic meaning. And in actual fact, people developing the Phrygian theory try to do that. Now, what I found interesting was that you said that on the Husserl view, perception plus linguistic meaning are not sufficient to determine the object being thought about. But it seems to me that it's interesting that in the passage we have here, it is the Erscheinungen that are not adequate. I mean, we have gleiche Erscheinungen. He doesn't say we have gleiche Wahrnehmungen.
No, that's right. And that's, maybe I should emphasize that even more, that what Husserl thinks is not sufficient, at least he cannot see a way of getting it to be sufficient, is the sense that is built into perception. So it's not the whole perceptual process, which of course is a process in the physical world. But because if you include also the physical aspects of it, then there will be no problem.
Right.
But he tries to do it by a notion of sense that is also involved in perception, but it does not include the physical aspect, but only the mental counterpart, you could say, of it. And that's the difference. Yeah.
Right.
So you could say that even this early, the first quotation I gave, which is the one we referred to here, is one where he thinks that perception is involved. That in all these later efforts, he tries to get a view on how perception is involved without leaving the abstract sphere of meaning.
Yeah.
No, yes, I believe that when you say that Husserl, in order to solve this problem, should bring in some physical stuff, in some sense, to determine univocally the referent or the indexical, that looks in the face of it very damaging for Husserl's general point of view, for Husserl's transcendental phenomenology, because of course that's exactly what you shouldn't do in a case like this, especially when dealing with meaning and something like this. And I wonder whether it wouldn't be easier to accept that indexicals are ambiguous in some situations.
That's ambiguous.
Yeah, because if you see in ideological investigations, Husserl says that not always the meaning, there are many terms with meanings that are allowed to fix univocally a reference, because you take any general term, that's the example that Husserl does. Of course, if you say a person, you can mean literally many different individuals with the general term, a person. Now, clearly, what you expect from an indexical is to work better, but anyway, an indexical, just like to be precise, you must use proper names. In a sense, an indexical is something which certainly fails in communication. I mean, when there are the two persons on the twin planets, each person understands what he is saying about his context. The point is that they couldn't talk to the rest of the universe and say, this, because in that case, this wouldn't be clear at all. I wonder whether it is just failure in we couldn't simply accept that an indexical is understood in a certain situation only by a person. And that's it.
Well, there are two points that I would make. First is that if you take the word person, that of course could relate to one person, many people, but Husserl is very, very clear, even from before the logical investigations, about the distinction between what we would call singular terms and general terms. A person is a general term, and there's nothing built into a general term that would require it to apply to one object, many objects, and so on. It could apply to no object, but what creates problems are the singular terms, where you understand the term as pretending to apply to just one object. You have that with proper names, and you have it with definite description. You have it with indexicals. But he would not want to assimilate indexicals to general terms. He's very struck by the fact that you have a family of expressions, the ones we normally call singular terms, that seem to behave differently. He doesn't discuss definite descriptions, because they are, I think, rather different semantically. But he's mostly concentrating on proper names and indexicals. And, definite descriptions weren't really properly developed. There's something in Frege and so on, but he's not going into that kind of what we call singular terms, but just focusing on proper names and indexicals. And he would not be satisfied with a theory that makes indexicals non-singular, like a person. Nor will he be satisfied with a theory that makes indexicals ambiguous. But he would want one where the reference is fixed by this interplay between linguistic meaning. When somebody uses an indexical, say this or I, we know what to look for. We'll find out who is speaking with I, or we will try to see whether the person is pointing to something or seem to want to indicate directedness, salience or something. And then we will we'll have that as the second stage in understanding the indexical. And the problem for Husserl is that second stage. I guess all theories of indexicals are really having problems with the second stage. The idea of having two stages, I think I've never seen anybody have before Husserl. But the problem is how to deal with the second stage. He sees that it's connected with perception, but he wants to have a notion of extended meaning, that both of these elements should be of the same family as linguistic sense. That's a little bit like Frege's mixed things, but Frege doesn't really take in perception at all in his discussion. For Husserl, it's very clear that perception comes in from the very beginning in his dealing with indexicals. But the problem for him is, can you focus only on the sense that is built into every act of perception, and by combining that kind of sense with linguistic sense, get something that is able to deal with the problems of indexicals? And then he gets the idea of the twin world and sees that here we really have a problem. And he discusses it in about 10 pages, where this is the first page that you got, and never comes to any satisfactory solution. But he's aware of it himself. Yeah.
Thanks. Where I found pretty much of mystery in Frege, is this. For Frege, there is no pure sense. Okay, there's no ideal sense, pure sense, sense as such. So, but Frege, mathematician himself, well, we remember, all of us remember morning star, the distinction between morning star and evening star, and the sense depends completely from context and etc. But what about numbers? There's no morning number or evening number. Yeah? There is a number, say 9. If I say 9, it's a kind of idealization. So the number, the meaning of number, or the meaning number is carrying out is always the same. So I totally accept distinction between morning star and the evening star. So sense and reference, that's fine. But if you can clarify this point, but the mathematical, pure mathematical expression, even simplest ones like number, like I say 9 planets, I say 9. So 9 is 9 in any context I can ever create and imagine and talk to.
Mm-hmm. Yes, certainly Frege was concerned mostly with mathematics in his developments, but and you wouldn't normally have indexicals, although there are Husserl gives examples also of use of indexicals in mathematics. But for Frege, of course, all the you say there's no view on pure sense. All senses, in a way, for Frege are pure, and you would have among abstract entities there would be the senses. There would be objects of various kinds, and numbers would be typical abstract entities. So both of them are abstract, and Husserl also would like to have a notion of sin that is abstract, and you can have one and the same abstract number to which you refer by quite different expressions, 9, 3 times 3, things like that. So there are many, also in the world of numbers, of course, you could have many different senses referring to the same number. Just as in the case of the morning star, evening star, you have different senses referring to the same object.
Yeah.
But this isn't really so helpful with indexicals, because it's not so much this, but what is a problem is to try to deal with indexicals by help of a notion of abstract sin and not bringing in anything else. There was somebody, I guess you said, talk about this transcendental idealism. I think that his idealism is so different from what Kant and Hegel and so on call idealism, that this thing I'm working on in Husserl, it's a big thing which I worked on for all these years, 50 years. I will also propose a different conception of idealism that ties, you could say that his idealism is the view that there is no perspective from nowhere. And when that is the way you interpret him, then actually there will be, you could get a kind of grip on indexicals in that way. And that I mentioned that is related also to qualia and things like that. That any full description of the world has to include a view from which, and that would be, I think, on the basis of the texts and so on, would be a way of regarding, interpreting his idealism, which I find is rather interesting. Well, I should mention that one reason that Kevin Mulligan and Barry Smith react so much against Husserl's idealism is that they think it's some of his deep German metaphysical things which they react against.
So it's not really a problem for Frege, because we could say from a Fregean point of view that the Husserlian notion of sense is ambiguous between the situation, fact, the perception, and the act of perception itself. I mean, the sense. Don't you have so the causal link, the exterior link in Frege by the notion, the one notion of mode of presentation plus sense?
Well, you see, mode of presentation, you could have an hallucination where you have a mode of presentation, and you, from your subjective point of view, it's just like a sword dangling there in front of you. But there's a problem with the causal process there, and the mode of presentation is not supposed to include that causal process.
There is a problem that when you see in the code, for example, when it takes the example of the recording, there you have a causal link with a causal link. I mean, with the I, which means that which in fact makes a problem. It's problematic from this point of view. Okay, because you have to contextualize. It's a problem, but generally you don't have this division in the mode of presentation, because when you have the recorded situation, when you have the recorded situation in the situation, you have there is a split between two orders of causality. In fact, the present one, when you hear the thing, and the moment where the recorded was made.
Yes.
Okay. So there, where you consider that, you see that the causal link. You can suppose that the causal link is something really important for him, for Frege, because there is a problem, and it shows equally that he has not yet resolved the problem of Indexicals. That's true, but the problem, I mean, the causal link seems to be guaranteed in his mind already in the national mode of presentation.
Well, he does this. He does, of course, have this notion of the mode of presentation, which is very central. But in that mode, there is no causal, no causal process involved. You could have a mode of presentation, which again reflects the idea that in the world there are causal processes, but the causal processes are not parts of the mode of presentation. So that's
I understand this question like that, like saying that the comprehension of the sense of Frege,
yes.
Husserl is so restrictive.
So restrictive. Yes, I think you could say that since both Frege and Husserl insist that the sense should be abstract and not include any element of the real world, that's a kind of constraint which for them becomes a challenge. It's always nice if a philosopher tries to work out something and see how far he can get it without leaving that constraint. And I think that what we can look upon in Husserl here, the things I talked about, are really attempts to work out the theory of indexicals without including causal processes in the notion of sense or thing. And of course, more recent work on indexicals tends to also find that very hard.
I just wonder about this new from nowhere, because it sounds paradoxical that normally this view from nowhere is thought of as sort of external view, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And but that's exactly what Husserl offers as a remedy, right? Just to replace, if I understood that's correct, to replace this abstract self, but by some sort of...
Yeah, but it's not a remedy, because he says that from an external point of view, this would be two different worlds. But then he says that that external point of view is not possibly the final one. There might be further a second level of external views again, and there's no end to that. There's no absolute end to the perspectives. That's one way of putting this idealism thing. Yeah.
Just as a matter of historical precision, because you said several times that Husserl was about the first to stress the importance of indexicals.
Oh, no, I'm sorry if I said that. Belzano, of course, was much further, and I guess we talked about Hegel.
Yes,
yeah.
And well, I would rather say that someone coming from the algebra of logic tradition, like Peirce, in fact, had a whole theory of the importance of the indexical iconic dimension within the proposition and the context.
That's right. No, I should.
And it's very developed, as a matter of fact, much more developed as the Husserl glimpses on the indexicals. But maybe also the reason why this is so is precisely because he has another conception of logic than Frege had.
Yes, that's right. I've already talked about the temporal things with Husserl and Frege, mentioning that Husserl had these more detailed discussions before Frege. But Peirce, and also you find traces in James, they are really also very well aware of this thing. And I guess partly because Peirce was really a general interest in semiotics. He had included a lot more in his discussion of language than many people like Frege, for example, would include.
And also in the theory of perception.
Yeah. So that's really...
So when we come to look at the history of thought, you find a lot of also in French grammatical theories in the 18th century, before Indexical in the Middle Ages. So they were also interested in.
Since we are at the let me mention that the Twinner's problem has been anticipated by the Stoics.
No, I think that these. When I wrote my dissertation, I wrote it on what I guess now would be called rigid designation, and I found a lot of anticipations in the Middle Ages. In fact, in my dissertation, I have a short discussion of medieval discussions of the same problem. And Quine, who was my advisor, who wasn't quite interested in philosophy, not especially history of philosophy, not history of medieval philosophy, he was really quite impressed by these medievals who had been not only seeing the problem, but also proposed things. For example, the medieval 13th century philosophers had a very clear distinction between what Quine calls the notional and the relational way of construing certain verbs. Like, I promise you a horse, does it mean there is a particular horse that I promise to give you, or does it mean I promise that there will be some horse or other that I'll give you? That was very, very systematically worked out. So I am sorry, I should really say that there's a lot, especially in the Middle Ages, that are highly relevant to it. I was mostly concerned here with Husserl and Frege and that German tradition at that time, which I think that Husserl was pretty early. And also I think as detailed a discussion of Indexical as the one you find in this text by Husserl, I haven't seen any place else.
But you also said you were talking about Bolzano, Frege, Husserl.
Yeah.
You said Husserl is the best. I thought that Bolzano had a very articulate theory of Indexicals with
Yeah.
to intuition and perception,
Yeah.
all that. And
Yeah.
I thought causal relation to
Yeah, that's right. Bolzano has this notion of Anschauung, which is very, very important and which Husserl takes over, and which brings in, with Bolzano, a role to play for the causal process. In order to have an Anschauung for Bolzano is a simple idea with a single object. And Bolzano says that that's such a curious thing that you can have it only when you are causally affected by something.
That's very similar to contemporary.
That's right, yeah.
Ideas.
Yeah, that's right. And of course Husserl knew Bolzano quite well. He really studied him very carefully. And it's only that Bolzano doesn't work it out really. He has the materials there for an interesting way of dealing with indexicals, but he doesn't work it out. And Frege, of course, sees that there are problems with his sphere of sense and reference connected with I and so on. And he has only these hints. But Husserl really sits down with it. Of course, Husserl wrote much more too. Frege left very little. And Husserl left 40,000 pages of manuscript. So he had plenty of space to discuss each problem. Yeah.
It's more question about what you said about the substitutability, the fact that you cannot replace an indexical by some other, some complex expression expressing what seems to be its sense, I and the speaker.
Yeah.
Now you said this is something like the essential indexical, but I thought when you started talking about this, I thought Husserl had realized what you said later, that he actually realized that indexicals are directly referential, and that's the reason why you cannot replace I by the person who is uttering this utterance, because that would be a description, that would not be directly referential, and therefore cannot substitute in many contexts. But then you say that this failure of substitution only shows that he was aware of the fact that there is a very special sense, which subjective or very special, such that you cannot replace it by any other expression. And that, I would think, obviously that's true, but that's the evidence for this is the fact that you not only replace I by proper name. But in the Husserl's text, what is he talking about really? Is he talking about the pair I and the speaker, or is he talking about the fact that you cannot replace I by, say, proper name or any other expression?
What he does in that passage that I quoted is that, I can quote it again, I'll translate it from German. We know that the word I is a word which the speaker in question uses to refer to himself or herself. He says, sich selbst in English. In German you don't have that. But this idea that we get when we hear the word is not the meaning of that word, because if it were the meaning, then we could have substituted for I an expression with the same meaning, and that we cannot do. So that
I interpret this as meaning that he saw that I was directly referential, because that's the only reason why.
Yeah, you see, I think.
You can't replace it by this.
Yes, you see, if you look at it from our point of view, you think that would be the natural thing to think. But what he says in the passage is simply that there must be something else that provides for that connection, because the sense involved is not one where you could simply construct another expression with the same sense. There will always be something missing. And I think he's aware that this thing that is missing is one that he has big problems characterizing if all he meant to make use of is sense. But I think in this passage, which is relatively early in the logical investigations, he really just sees the problem. And he doesn't really... it's clear that from his later discussion, he doesn't want to solve the problem by having what we would call a theory of direct reference, where we would often appeal to some kind of causal connection or some other material connection. So I think he sees how you can see one way of putting his problem is how can we deal with indexicals if everything on the thin level, the sense level, is such that no other expression could replace the indexical. And it would be easy, I guess, if you said, well, there's a causal relation or some direct relation. But that's what he tries to avoid. And I think that's what makes him have to go back again and try to deal with it. And he gets it probably with the twin word. Because again, if you just appeal to a causal relation, there wouldn't be too much of a problem with the twin word. But the way he wants to deal with it, he doesn't find a way. And I think that this idea of a direct reference is one that would be a very natural one for Husserl to think of.
Yeah, he has it from what you said.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. I guess I could quote this, like this one passage I quoted just after this one. I say this, and now mean the paper lying before me. Perception is responsible for the relation of my word to this object. But my meaning does not lie in perception. An act of this meaning builds itself on my perception. Depends on it. If I just read the first part of that, then you are almost onto a direct reference theory. It says, I say this, and now mean the paper lying before me. Perception is responsible for the relation of my word to this object. If you stop there, it would be very, very close to what we think of as a direct reference theory. But then...
But direct reference, I only meant something which I think you really read the passage from Husserl that exactly says it. That's the idea that the connection to the object is unmediated.
Yeah, this is
no conceptual. It's not the value, as it were. It's not something conceptual. It's directly that thing.
I think that's the next passage that I wrote. I'll read that passage too, and then maybe we should focus on that, because I agree that Husserl comes so close to this kind of modern view, but he really struggles to preserve that notion of sense, which remains such. This passage, I think that you have in mind, is this one. Indexicals are much like proper names, if the latter function with their authentic meaning. And that to mean, I think, to take a more recent example, we have unfortunately a proper name in Norwegian that has been turned into a general term, namely quisling. You could say about the person that he's a quisling, he's collaborating with the occupation forces. And that's why he has to say, like proper names, if the latter function with their authentic meaning. And then we get to what is important for you. For a proper name, also names an object directly, like the indexicals. There you have the word directly. It's direct in German. It means it, not in the attributive way, as the bearer of these or those properties, but without such conceptual mediation as that which it itself is, just as perception may set it before our eyes. I think that is...
there is not only direct reference, but the connection
but it is the
perception,
connection.
And therefore there is a sense and so on. And I think that guarantees that there is no possibility of substituting for one such directly referential expression, the conceptual or attributive expression like the description.
No, I
so
think
that's the way I understand the first passage.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, that this passage may be the closest he comes to anticipating theories of direct reference. But he as you notice...
But this is compatible with sense. I mean, direct reference, not in the sense, but yes, in another sense. So
no, there's sense involved, that's right. And that's important in his view on perception also. Perception for him is very rich, and there is a lot of conceptual content involved in perception. But what is the crucial thing that he struggles with all the time is that material element in perception. And
there is also
here he says
this notion of conceptual.
Yeah.
He says no conceptual mediation. Now some people think that when you have to perceive the object, Bolzano, for example, there is this distinction between the sort of intuitive donation of the object in perception and the conceptual donation of the object in thought.
Yeah.
And if you use that, then you have two sorts of senses. The senses that sort of there is senses based on perception, and then it's available with the theory of direct reference. And that's apparently what.
You know, I think what Husserl emphasizes, he doesn't emphasize it in the text, but I think what he is very concerned with in this passage I read is that indexicals and proper names relate to their object not because of properties that those objects have, but in some other way. And that's the other way that he wants to clear up. And he then has a notion of sense, which I haven't talked much about, but where there is an element of what he calls the determinable X, which is a way of relating to the object without doing it by way of properties. And that's fairly clear, both from this and from his development of the determinable X. But I think what really creates the problem for him that he struggles with in all this manuscript is that he does want to develop a notion of sense, which doesn't have to do with properties and so on, but which still is such that you can explain the relation between you and a unique object without bringing in this material process which takes place because your sensory organs are affected. He can bring it in to the extent that that causal process is reflected on the sense level. That is, I mentioned this briefly in connection with his view on perception, that he has a kind of causal theory of perception, but he wants to really stay with what you have on the conceptual level and not bring in a material element. I think that seems to me to be what he struggles with all the time.
What do you think exactly about the way Husserl tries to solve the problem of twinners? Do you accept this solution or this outline of solution? Or do you think that externalism is unavoidable?
Well, I think that I agree with Husserl that what he manages to do is not satisfactory. So he never really.
So you agree? Oh yes.
He had a lot of self-criticism.
So please give me the objection against this solution.
Well, the objection is that the kind of solution he's hinting at, but is that if we get to an external perspective, we see that there are two different objects referred to by the word this in these two words. And then he has this view that insight, in any situation you are in the real world, there could be a corresponding step to a new perspective from which you can see that you were confused in this world. And there are some hints in Husserl that if you iterate that going to an external perspective, and you then try to look at that external perspective from a further, even more external. From one external perspective, you couldn't see that there were two different objects, but then at some stage you might get to one where you see that these are distinct objects. And Husserl sometimes talks as if the real reference is the one that you would get to if that process were carried to a kind of ideal limit. You have similar views by many people on truth, for example, and so on. Peirce, to take him, had a kind of attempt to define truth as the kind of limit to which scientific theories would gradually approximate. That you could never be sure that you have the truth because it could always be further theories that turned out to be better. And you could say that this way of looking at the twin world, that you find a perspective and see that two things where you thought there was one, and then even at that stage you could go further perspective, discover that there's three things, many things, and so on. And in fact, I look upon Husserl's phenomenology as very much a perspectival theory. There's nothing on which you don't have to have a perspective. And that's, of course, what I hinted when I said that actually his idealism should be regarded as that. There is no view from nowhere. And that's one way of that he seems to be moving in these 10 pages or so where he discusses the twin world, that maybe reference, the reference and truth are really part of the same family. And what you really refer to would be what you will discover that you refer to if you carry out this iterative process to its limit. Just as for Peirce, truth is what you get to, that limit that every improving scientific theories would approach. But there are problems with that notion of a limit. You don't have any measure, and you don't have any guarantee that you are improving.
I've got just a very sort of naive and ignorant question. Yeah. I mean, from the sort of cartoon book accounts of the history of this moment the succeeding moment in early 20th century philosophy, we hear that Heidegger criticized Husserl for not paying enough attention, so to speak, to the embeddedness of the body in the world. And it sounds as though you're telling us that actually Husserl did, in fact.
Oh, yes.
And so how inaccurately did Heidegger read Husserl?
Well, I'm always happy when I can point out inaccuracies in Heidegger, because I think that Heidegger was really, in fact, Sein und Zeit was dedicated to Husserl. So Husserl was very happy, when he received this book from his student. And when he started reading it, he got less and less happy. And you find in the margin of the copy, which is kept in the archive in Louvain, there you find that Husserl starts writing in the margin, but what Heidegger says here is only what I say there and there, but translated into another terminology. And Husserl even says what the translation is. And then gradually he gets more irritated, and he writes often translated into a deep-sounding terminology. And in one place he even adds, after translated into a deep-sounding terminology, and robbed of every justification. So he feels very frustrated, and that's clear from many other comments that what particularly frustrated him was that Heidegger did not justify, but he presented his views like a preacher. He would state something and maybe state it twice more and hope that the reader will believe it. And I think that is really what was worried the most about. But of course he also was really disappointed that Heidegger tried to hide his sources. And what is striking is that if you look at the earlier manuscript versions of Being and Time, the early versions use Husserl's terminology, but when it finally came to print it, then that terminology. So Husserl points out in one place, look how curiously Heidegger has to express himself in order to avoid using the word intentionality. And your specific question about the role of the body, that in the logical investigations there's not much on the body at all. But from about 1915 on, Husserl starts discussing the body. And there are drafts of 2 more volumes of the ideas. The one volume that was published in his lifetime came in 1913, but he was already working then at drafts of the next 2 volumes. And they were never published, but Heidegger had access to them. Husserl gave the manuscripts to Heidegger. And Heidegger never mentions them, but Merleau-Ponty had access to them in 1939 in the Husserl archives. And Merleau-Ponty, of course, who discusses the body quite extensively, he is generous. He says that he's very grateful for these ideas about the body from Husserl's manuscripts. And those manuscripts are written 10 years before Being and Time. But in any case, I think that there are some indications in these later discussions from 1912 of the twin world that Husserl did see that the body and the affectations of the body have to be brought in when we want to get the proper theory of indexicals. But he never, at that stage, he had not even started systematically to think about the body. But that came 5-6 years later.
Let's follow up on your question. I still don't see why the admission that there's no view from nowhere is an objection to the solution that appeals to an external element. Okay, you have to step outside the perspective of one or either of two men in order to realize that, or to understand our intuition that they're actually referring to two different things. But that's enough. I mean, the point is not that by adopting this external point of view, you should yourself be able to determine what the exact reference is. So even if there's a third perspective, that I mean, what determines finally the thing is the causal physical relations. So
no, I think you're quite right that you could accept this this progression of further external perspectives, and also include these material elements in your account of indexicals, include perception as a causal process and so on. So it's only that Husserl tried to avoid that second and go into the first. And you know, there are small fragments here and there in the manuscript that indicated one little problem he had with going external was that how can you know the contents of your mind if this external notion comes in? Davidson discusses that, and there was a dissertation recently in Florida by a person who discusses quite in detail the problems that externalism raise for one's knowledge of one's own mind. And there's also a German philosopher, Sven, he's in München, and he has also written his dissertation on the problems that externalism raise for one's possibility or ability to know one's own mind. You know, it's both of these people argue that it's possible, but it does require a good deal of discussion to see what it is. Yeah. Sven Bernecke is the German.
No other questions? Thank you very much, Professor Føllesdal.